The next session, we're going to talk about something not controversial at all, which is genetics and violent or antisocial behavior. Once again, we will ask both of our speakers to give their talks, and then we'll have a discussion session moderated by Dr. Paul Appelbaum. So our first speaker is Dr. Alexandra Burt. She is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Michigan State University, and her research focuses on understanding the causes of antisocial behaviors, with a particular focus on gene-environment interaction. Actually, gene-environment interplay, so we don't have to get into a fight about what's interaction or not. She's also interested in the causes and manifestations of digital aggression, which is a new phenomenon that we really know very little about. She uses a wide range of research strategies, including twin studies, adoption studies, and experimental paradigms. And she studies individuals across the lifespan, including children, adolescents, students, and older adults. Thank you very much, Dr. Burt.
Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today kind of about the science behind what we know about genetic influences on violent and aggressive behavior. And then I'll talk a little bit about the implications. But before we begin, I'm sort of a stickler for construct definition. And so I just wanted to talk about sort of violence versus physical aggression. And we think of them as, in sort of popular speech, they're kind of the same thing, but they actually, scientifically, we do define them a little differently. Violence is typically defined as something that is more severe, so it might be like stabbing, shooting, it's a more severe form of violence where there is the potential for great physical injury on the part of the victim. And physical aggression can have a severe element to it, but also includes a lot of garden variety aggression, sort of shoving on the playground, but can range all the way up to assault. So it's a little bit of there's sort of an artificial cut point between aggression and violence, but I think it's important for reasons that you'll understand in a second when we talk about the developmental trajectories of these things. At certain points in the talk today, I am going to distinguish violence and aggression from non-aggressive forms of antisocial behavior. And so these include things like theft, vandalism, lying, etc. And the reason I'm going to do that is because these behaviors are actually pretty highly correlated with physical aggression. Correlations in the 0.4 to 0.6 range, usually kind of on the sort of upper end of that. And even so, there are a surprising number of meaningful differences, and so I think it serves as a really useful contrast that I will use occasionally. Okay. So just to drill down a little bit more, in most of the studies that I'm going to talk about today, the measure of aggression in question they typically specifically index the frequency of specific aggressive behaviors, like how often does this person bite, how often do they hit, how often do they, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so but it's often about frequency. Intentionality is the intention to do harm relates very strongly to our notions of guilt and responsibility and is deeply embedded in the criminal justice system, right? First-degree murder versus second-degree murder versus manslaughter, etc. But is rarely ever considered in the empirical literature, and as a result, I'm not really going to cover that today because the research base just really isn't there. It's typically assumed. Rightly or wrongly, it is typically assumed in the empirical literature. So let's talk a little bit about developmental trajectories because I want to make sure we're all on the same page about when these behaviors express themselves. So physical aggression is interesting because contrary to what folks might think, it is actually at its most prevalent in the toddler years. 65% or so of toddlers bite, kick, and or hit. And let me be clear, they mean to hurt you when they do that. I had a toddler and I have another one right now. They mean to hurt you. But as it happens, they're quite small, and so they can't do much damage yet. But it is not for lack of trying. So just to show you, to orient you to this graph here, we have a physical aggression score. You can see in the bottom, those are the very low levels. I'm going to focus on the moderate and the high, which are the two higher ones. But you'll see that those account for going on 70% of the sample. And what you can see is that they are not engaging in a zero amount of physical aggression. So most of the toddlers in the sample were engaging in some physical aggression. Luckily for all of us, as they get bigger and we socialize them, which I'll get back to in a little bit, the frequency of aggression decreases. It decreases throughout adolescence and into adulthood. So this would be a typical chart. And so what you can see is that at age 4, you've got a relatively higher levels of physical aggression, and they're kind of decreasing in general across up through age 18, where the low decreasers have basically gone down to 0 levels. The high group is still engaging in significantly more, but less than they were when they were younger. Violence looks a little different. Violence actually increases from childhood to adolescence, although it becomes again rare by early adulthood. So these are the mean number of violent crimes from ages 7 to 70 in a sample of juvenile delinquents. And so what you can see is that essentially no 7-year-olds are are committing violent crimes, or next to none, right? And then you have a huge kind of increase in the number of violent crimes committed in sort of late adolescence through emerging adulthood, at which point it drops off again. So some suggestions as to why this might look so different than physical aggression. It's not entirely clear yet, but the way people typically talk about this is that violent acts, small children are not yet capable of cognitively or physically capable of committing actual violent crime the way we define it, and they don't know how to use weapons. If they do shoot someone, it's an accident, right? They just don't necessarily have the cognitive wherewithal to engage in high levels, or to engage in violent crime per se. But as the cognitive wherewithal increases, those who are prone to such behaviors are more likely to engage in those behaviors. Luckily, even this becomes rare by early adulthood. One thing I've not mentioned yet is true for both physical aggression and violence, is that there's a huge gender disparity, much more frequently seen in males than in females, and that is true beginning at age 2. The other interesting thing about physical aggression is that it shows actually even though the mean level decreases over time, the rank order stability is actually quite high. So these are stability correlations over different year intervals. And you can see that the 2-year correlation is quite high. It goes down, of course, as the interval increases, but remains relatively high. And I'll contrast that to, again, RB here is non-aggressive rule breaking, but still antisocial behavior. And you can see that the stabilities are much lower. In fact, the 2-year correlation is indistinguishable for rule breaking, is indistinguishable from the 8-year correlation for physical aggression. So there's less rank order stability for non-aggressive antisocial behaviors than for physically aggressive. So I just use that as a point to say that physical aggression does actually appear to be a relatively stable interpersonal trait. Okay, so now that we've got all the background, just to quickly talk about what our objectives are today, I want to just review what we know about genetic influences on violence/aggression. And I want to think a little bit about the implications and kind of the bigger evolutionary picture, and then hopefully kick that off for Dr. Tabery to take us home with the ethical piece. Okay, so this is a study of 12.5, what I'm going to show you here is familial risk for violent crime. So this is a study of more than 12.5 million individuals. It's using one of those brilliant Scandinavian sort of nationalized registers. And what they did was they linked up information about familial relationships with the national crime registers. And so this is your odds ratio, the risk of from a given, if you have the target and then you look at their parent, what's the parent's risk of being convicted of a violent crime? What's the sibling's risk, et cetera? And so what you can see is that the odds ratio that would say there's no increased risk would be 1. You can see that there's a considerable increased risk for first-degree relatives, so that violent crime is running in families. That first-degree relatives of people who've committed crimes are themselves more likely to be convicted of violent crimes. You'll see here that as the genetic relationship goes down, so as the proportion of genes shared decreases, so too do the odds ratios. So grandparents, aunts, uncles, half-siblings all share about 25% of their genes. These are significantly lower than those of first-degree relatives. Third-degree relatives are cousins, right? They share 12.5% of their genes. And there is, in fact, it's already fully leveled off by that point. There is still an increase in risk for cousins, in terms of sort of violent criminal convictions, but it is actually not different than that for half-siblings. Okay, so what does this mean? All I've showed you so far is that there's familial risk, so you don't know if it's genetic or if it's environmental. So you can pull that out a little bit in this same study. So these are the same parent and sibling correlations you just saw. And so these are folks, the way they defined parent and sibling in the study, these were people who shared both their genes and their environment. So these were, biological family members that were that had grown up together or were living together, or that they had raised their children. So if you look at adopted away children and siblings, so these are people who share genes but not environments. Right? So this is a woman gives birth to a baby. That baby is adopted into another family. She shares genes with that child, but it does not participate in the rearing of that child, right? So you've sort of cleaned up, you've separated out the genes and the environment and kind of disambiguated them at a very natural cut point. You can see there is still an increased risk that the adopted away child and sibling of someone convicted of a violent crime is more likely to have committed a violent crime, but the odds ratio is, is not that high. Interesting, and it is in fact no higher than that for adopted children and adopted siblings. So these are people who share environments but not genes. The take home here is that, my conclusion here would be that both genes and environments appear to be important based on this pattern of familial and resemblance. Clearly, though, there seems to be some kind of a merging of the two that is bigger than the sum of its two parts, right? The odds ratios for the G and E are typically more than double those, right? They're not additive. Okay, so. All right, so there's genes. All right, so genes are important. Okay, what are those genes? We have no idea. So I'm a part of the largest consortium conducted to date, looking at trying to identify specific genes that are predicting antisocial behavior. This is actually a paper that is not even yet in press. It is just we're in the process of submitting. They did find, when they looked across all the million or so SNPs in the sample, that it predicted about 5% of the variance in antisocial behavior, but they were not able to identify any of those specific genes at a genome-wide significance level. Now, if you look just in females or just in males, there were 2 interesting hits in females and 1 interesting one in males. They did not overlap across sex. But those are, of course, smaller samples, and so I would call it, what would I call it? I would call it okay evidence. Not great, not very strong, not genome-wide significant. So genes seem to be important, but this slide is really just a way of saying we've not identified what those genes might be. Okay, so the way I think to so we've got our family study, and we're not really having a lot of luck with the molecular genetic piece, so I'm going to take us back to the twin study piece where we actually have findings that are interpretable and might mean something, and that we can follow, at least until we do get, if we ever do get more hits. So these are the results of a meta-analysis that I did of twin and adoption studies of aggression and non-aggressive antisocial behavior. And what you can see here is that in the orange bars, there are, the genetic influences on physical aggression are high. They're quite high, some of the higher ones that you see for psychiatric disorders. And interestingly, they're significantly higher than those seen for non-aggressive. So again, I use this as a point of contrast just to say that it's not necessarily that rule breaking is correlated about the 0.5 level with physical aggression, and yet is not as heritable and is more influenced by the environment. So there's some important phenotypic distinctions that people don't always pay attention to, but that I think are actually, if you're going to study a trait, you need to be sure you're actually studying that trait. Other work that I and others have done have been looking at nuclear twin family models. We haven't talked about these today. These are basically extended twin models where they incorporate parents or other first-degree relatives, and it allows you to estimate more than just A, C, and E, A being genetic, and C being the shared environment, and E being the non-shared environment. You can also estimate non-additive, or sometimes called D. And when you do that for physical aggression, you find evidence that, yes, there are additive genetic influences on physical aggression, but there are also non-additive genetic influences on physical aggression. So what that might mean is that you both have a situation where with the additive, it's like the number of genes you have, and that contributes to parent-child resemblance. Whereas with non-additive, it's typically thought of as more generation-specific and is about the interaction between genes. So if indeed a big portion of the genetic variance in physical aggression is non-additive, it makes sense that we're not identifying it then in a GWAS because they're looking for additive only. So just as something to know. Okay, couple more things on the genetic influences of physical aggression. The first is that genetic influence that I mentioned is present as early as age 3. It has not been looked at prior to that in any large-scale studies. But in the larger-scale studies, it has been identified as early as age 3. It does not change very much thereafter, so it is over 50% heritable at age 3 and goes up a little bit thereafter, but not much. It's sort of online by age 3. That said, at age 7, there was new genetic variance. There was evidence that some different genes were important at age 7 than were important at age 3. So that's potentially interesting. But in any case, what we're seeing is that, kind of consistent with the developmental phenotypic data, physical aggression as a construct seems to be pretty well online and sort of settled by age 3. Which is kind of shocking when we think about it. And certainly by age 7, there's almost no evidence of genetic innovation thereafter. And so that I've looked in adolescence and in several other studies and have not, no study, no sample has deviated from that result. There is not a lot of evidence that the heritability or that genetic influences on physical aggression are changing much in adolescence. There's really simply no evidence of that. And again, that contrasts very much to what we see for non-aggressive rule breaking, where we see a huge increase in adolescence in genetic influences that really aren't as present prior to adolescence. So again, physical aggression is a unique thing that needs to be separated from antisocial behavior in general. And I will say that most people in the field don't do that. And I think, including the GWAS didn't do it. I tried, but I'm only one, I'm one author. And but if they're not separating it out and it looks so different, yeah, right, we're not identifying the genes, yeah. Okay, I'm going to just close on what I think is, what to me is a very exciting and I think very important set of genetic findings for physical aggression, and that is that there is good evidence now that the level of familial, and as I'll show you in a second, genetic risk varies with the level of disadvantage of the participants. And by that I mean that there is, this is again this sample of 12.5 million Swedes. What you can see is that the risk for criminal conviction varies with the socioeconomic status of the participants, such that there is more familial risk in advantaged environments and less familial risk in disadvantaged environments. Okay. Twin studies have found the same thing. So this is one of my studies where we looked at neighborhood poverty. We were looking at conduct problems because these are kids. But so what we found was that genetic influences there decreased essentially monotonically, more or less, with increasing levels of neighborhood poverty. And interestingly, it's not just that the genetic influences decrease with increasing neighborhood poverty. The environmental influences increase. So what that would suggest is a little bit of a different way of thinking about gene-environment interaction. The way people often think about that is kind of with a diathesis stress model, like, oh, you have this gene of risk, and then this bad thing happened to you, and so now you're expressing that gene of risk. But if that bad thing hadn't happened to you, you wouldn't be expressing that gene of risk. What this would actually suggest is not that at all. What this would suggest is that genes of risk matter more in the absence of environmental risk. But in the presence of environmental risk, it doesn't really matter if you're at genetic risk. You're at higher risk for the outcome regardless of your genetic predispositions. And so this is sometimes called a bioecological gene-environment interaction. And this is the idea that, I'll just spend one more minute on this because I think this is important. Lewontin had this analogy that he used that I think really encapsulates this well. So he talked about, you have a bag of seeds, genetically variable seeds, and you've got a rich, fertile field with 2 feet of topsoil, and it's brilliant, and any plant would want to be there. And then you have kind of another soil that's dry and rocky and has almost no nutritive value. Okay, you take half your bag and you put it in the good soil and the other half in the bad soil. What you're going to find is that the plants in the good soil are taller than the ones in the shorter soil, but you'll also find that there's more genetic variability in the sense that to the extent that this plant is taller than this other plant is a function of the genetic predispositions of this plant versus that plant. In the bad soil, it kind of doesn't matter if you have a lot of genes for tall plant height. You don't have the nutrients necessary to reach that height. And so this is a variation on that. This is the idea that genetic risk seems to matter more when there's relatively little in the environment that is kind of pushing you in that direction. The base rate is also much lower in that environment. In environments where we typically think of high crime neighborhoods, lots of neighborhood disadvantage, in those neighborhoods it matters a lot less. According to these data, which has now been replicated in 4 different studies, used different research groups, different samples, using different techniques, methodological techniques. Okay, so our interim summary before we start talking about implications. Aggression. The prevalence is highest during the toddler years and the early childhood years. Unlike with violence, where we see instead the higher, we see a lot more violent crime in adolescence than we do in childhood. In both cases, though, the behavior dissipates during adulthood. There's less physical aggression and there's less violence in our developmental stage. Good, right? But what's interesting is that even though the prevalences change over time, the rank order stability is high. So the most aggressive toddler is likely to be an aggressive adolescent and likely to be an aggressive adult. That's what the phenotypic developmental data say. It has high levels of rank order stability. It is influenced by both additive and non-additive genetic influences. As I say, 3 SNPs identified in a meta-analysis, a GWAS meta-analysis, but they differ across sex, and it's not really clear what's gonna, we'll see. By middle childhood, the relevant genetic effects have been fully activated, and it's less genetic and more environmental in origin among those living in disadvantage. Okay, so that's as far as I'm concerned, what we know about the genetic influences on aggression. Okay, neato. What does that all mean? Why did you tell me that? Okay, so I've thought about this some, and I sort of dabble occasionally in thinking about kind of evolutionary sorts of things, which I think is natural for someone who has an interest in genes. But I do think that the kind of uniquely early timing of genetic expression for physical aggression may imply certainly that there's a partially unique evolutionary origins for physical aggression and for rule breaking. But if we drill down onto physical aggression, I think physical aggression is interesting because we think of it here, we're thinking of it as a bad thing. It's psychopathology. You hurt people with that. And those things are all true, and I don't want to take away from the sort of the moral judgment about we don't like it when a person hurts another person. I agree with that moral judgment very strongly. I do not want to be hurt, and I do not want my children hurt, or anyone. But that being said, it is also the case that aggression has important advantages in certain contexts. Certainly, protection for yourself or your children or your family is something that it's even justifiable legally, right? If someone's attacking you or your kids, you're allowed to intervene. It might keep them alive, which I think we could all appreciate as an advantage. Also, in times of scarcity, if you're stronger and bigger, you'll get the food, right, if food is available. So it has advantages, even though we think of it as an ugly thing. Okay, so building on that, I would argue, and it's not my argument, it's others' arguments, Tremblay's argument, in fact, that the high prevalence of aggression during the toddler years might suggest that it's actually been highly selected for in our evolutionary history, and that it's sort of a species necessity, that the ability to engage in aggression when needed is something that is adaptive for our species. And that what we do is we shape it to fit with our simultaneous need to live in social groups. So what we say is, in the time of war, you can aggress over there to those people, but you don't aggress in here in our group. And so what that would suggest is not that the children are learning to be aggressive. It's that we're sort of teaching them not to be aggressive. So when we talk about genetic influences on aggression, are we even talking about it the right way? Instead of talking about this gene made you more aggressive, instead, maybe the idea is that it's instead reflecting either a lack of exposure to socialization or an inability to profit from socialization. So it's not that it's a gene for aggression. It's a gene related to your ability to be socialized. To control your aggressive impulses most of the time. So that's a different kind of way of thinking. When we talk about genes for psychopathology, the way people typically talk about it is, this gene makes it, which is wrong, right? But this gene makes it, these genes make it more likely that you'll be aggressive. Well, maybe, but I actually think, given that most toddlers are aggressive, I would actually argue that maybe what this gene is doing is making it more difficult to socialize you out of aggression, or in some cases that you're not being exposed to socialization. Okay. So some data relevant to this socialization hypothesis. There is some actually interesting data around this. I'm going to talk about two things: reaction to punishment and fearlessness. Okay, so this is an excellent review of child effects in conduct disorder. So in the psychology literature and the developmental literature, people talk about parent effects and child effects. So parent effects are things that parents do to their children and sort of shape their behavior in that way. Child effects are almost like the way that the child is an equal partner in the parent-child relationship, and they are shaping the parenting they receive. So anyone, as Eric was saying, anyone who has more than one child, you don't parent them the same way because they simply need different things. My daughter has never been in a timeout for hitting one or hitting anyone. She's just never done it. I've never told her not to do it. She just doesn't do it. My almost 3-year-old son, multiple times a week. Multiple times, and he's never been hit by me or by him. No, he's never been hit, but he just has an instinct that it's mine, and you will give it to me right now or I will make you suffer. Okay, so that's what we mean by child effects. It's basically the way the child is shaping their environment. Okay, so he put together a table of experimental and observational studies, and one of them was, the studies he talked about was a reaction to punishment trial. And so what they did was they looked at aggressive versus non-aggressive boys. And what they found was that following punishment, so if they engaged in a misbehavior, you punish them. using the same punishment strategies, the non-problem boys would appropriately, in response to punishment, decrease their behavior. The conduct disordered or aggressive boys did not. In fact, in some cases, they increase the behavior in response to being mad that you've punished them. So it's a different response to socialization in an in vivo, in the moment kind of way. They literally might be harder to socialize. They're not responding to punishment in the same way as other folks do. And so that might then make it, because they're less responsive to punishment, there's a lot of punishment in life. Life is a lot about punishment, as it turns out. And so they might be more likely to place themselves in risky or harmful situations. There's other explanations for this, but one is that that they're placing themselves in these situations. And I'll build on this in a second. With some data on the next slide. So they think about this as almost a fearlessness. So instead, when you've punished me, I didn't like it, but instead of being scared that you'll do it to me again, so I'll change my behavior, they don't make that leap for whatever reason, and they're not responding to punishment in the same way because they're not scared of being punished. One physiologic measure of fearlessness is low resting heart rate. We think of low resting heart rate as a good thing, a sign of health, but it actually also predicts bad things, as we'll talk about in a second. There's a recent study that came out, again using one of those huge Swedish, not 12.5 million, because they had to use resting heart rate data that was measured at a mandatory military conscription at age 18. They linked up that data with violent crime data. And here's what they found. So the first, these are the people with the lowest heart rates, the lowest resting heart rates, and then the fifth, these are the people with the highest resting heart rates. Okay, so what you can see is that the hazard ratio, there's a 39% increase in the hazard ratio for violent crime in those with the lowest heart rates versus those with the highest heart rates. And there's well over 100,000 people per row. So it's a pretty reliable estimate. You see the same increase for nonviolent crime, but it is not as pronounced. And of course, given the sample size, you can imagine that is a whoppingly significant difference. But here's what's interesting, and here's why I think it actually might reflect fearlessness, is that you see the same pattern of increase for assault injuries, like being murdered or punched or hurt in some way, and for unintentional injuries, like being in a car accident or falling. Essentially, they're not as scared. They don't appear to be as scared of hurting themselves. And guess what? When you're not, you hurt yourself more. So it's an interesting way and the data have largely been interpreted via a fearlessness hypothesis. So they may be hypo-responsive to punishment, but there's also evidence, which I'm not getting into, that they're hyper-responsive to reward. And so a clinical implication, I'm also a clinical psychologist, might be that as soon as your kid is engaging in aggression, like at age 2 or 3, that you're implementing behavior charts and trying to shape that behavior. And if you can't do it through typical timeout strategies, you might use reward-based strategies. How many more minutes do I have? Okay, all right. A final thing I want to mention is that because environmental influences appear to be more prominent in disadvantaged neighborhoods versus advantaged neighborhoods, I think it could potentially have some implications for the way we think about our intervention and prevention trials. So if we can identify shared and non-shared, but I'm thinking about shared here, environmental influences, and target them in treatment, we should be able to enact positive change for both the child in treatment and for the siblings who are not in treatment but just reside in the same house. That's a potential, if it's a family-wide effect. Okay. So what might these environmental influences be in disadvantaged neighborhoods? I mean, one would be parenting. And there's some data to suggest that, in fact, family-wide intervention trials, I won't go into all the details because I don't have time, but that family-wide interventions for criminal behavior reduce crime in both the target child, but also in their siblings. Whereas interventions for criminal behavior in the target child that are just about individual therapy don't. So it means that we could basically be, target one kid with family-based interventions and sort of improve behavior for siblings. The final thing I want to mention, and this is something that is, I think, of great current interest, certainly in the state of Michigan, but even beyond, is toxicant exposure. There is absolutely no question that people living experiencing high levels of disadvantage in their neighborhood and so forth are exposed to much higher level of environmental toxicants than those living in advantaged neighborhoods, much, much higher level. And not just one toxicant, many toxicants. So I just wanted to show you this as sort of a closing. So this is a 23-year lag between the tons of leaded gasoline per 1,000 of population, and then 23 years later, the violent crime rate. What you can see is a very sort of disturbing and consistent link between the two, which is that the more leaded gasoline there is in the population, the higher the violent crime rate is. And as leaded gasoline has been phased out, the violent crime rate dropped, which certainly maps onto the relatively low violent crime rates we have now relative to what we had 20, 30 years ago. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
I want to introduce Dr. James Tabery, he is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Utah, where he also holds appointments in the departments of internal medicine and pediatrics. Dr. Tabery is the Director of Education and Career Advancement for Utah's Center for Excellence in ELSI Research, which is one of our sister Ceer centers. His research focuses on the philosophy of science, applied ethics, and the intersection between them. He's used research on gene-environment interaction to discuss misconceptions in genetic screening and challenge the idea that there are quote-unquote normal humans. In 2014, he published the book that Dr. Turkheimer told us about, Beyond Verses, The Struggle to Understand the Interaction of Nature and Nurture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As Dr. Oppen mentioned, at Utah we have a Center for Excellence in LC Research as well, or a preparatory center, hoping to get one. And so as a result, quite often we're looking for other models to see what works. And time and again, I can say we look to Columbia for examples of annual conferences, for the Brain Genetics newsletter. You're a paradigm, a model to follow, and so that's been very useful for us. Since it's late in the day, I thought I'd start with an interactive exercise, but it's going to require a little bit of time traveling. So you're going to have to imagine you're a juror. Here's the time traveling, though. Most jurors do not enter a courtroom having just been exposed to 4 hours of detailed information about what genes do and don't do. So see if you can sort of transport yourself back to 1 p.m. before you walk through the door and imagine you're in this scenario. So the scenario is, we've got an individual who committed a violent crime and was convicted of that violent crime. Let's say it was a road rage. An argument escalated. Our gentleman there, Stephen, pulls out a gun and shoots the other person and seriously injures the other person. And you're going to have to sentence Stephen. So there's going to be two expert witnesses. The first expert witness is a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist comes and tells you, the jurors, that Stephen has a psychiatric disorder, a personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, which makes it very difficult for him to control his impulses. And that's in part what, that sort of is designed to help you understand why he did what he did when he was in that road rage incident. So the first task is, with the crime that you've now heard that he committed, and what you now have from the psychiatrist, what would you sentence him to? How many years would you put him away for? And then hold on to that number. Second expert witness comes. This person is a neurobiologist. Let's call him a neurogeneticist. And this person comes and says, I want you to also know that I screened Stephen, and it turns out that he has a gene that leads to a chemical imbalance in his brain. And that's actually what contributes to the impulsivity that we see in the personality disorder, which in turn is why, helps you understand why he behaved the way he did when he was in the road rage incident. So now the question is, what would you sentence him to with that additional information? Okay, and you've got sort of three options here. You might have reduced your sentence when you got that additional genetic story compared to the psychiatric story. You might have increased your sentence when you got that additional neurogenetic story compared to the psychiatric story. Or you might not have changed it at all, right? Philosophers, scientists, legal scholars, social psychologists are becoming increasingly interested in this particular question because this kind of science is becoming more common in courtrooms. So it is now the case that genetic information about people's genomes is being presented during trials with the aim to influence the way the jurors or the judges think about what that person did and how they should be treated. Okay. It is now a fact that neuroimaging, that images of brains are being introduced in trials where expert witnesses are saying, see, that's where you can see that he's a psychopath. Look how his brain is different there from this brain over here from a normal human. Okay. With the aim to influence how these people are treated. Okay. When that information, when those neurogenetic stories started making their way into criminal trials, initially the people who were introducing them were for the defense. They were aimed explicitly to reduce punishment. But very quickly, scholars pointed out that this is actually something of a double-edged sword, or at least it could be a double-edged sword. Because the same exact information that might incline you to sentence this person to less time, or to give them a less severe punishment because they were less control of their behavior at the time that they did the act, could also incline you to give them a more serious punishment, to lock them away for longer, because it looks like they're going to, if what's wrong with them is in their brain, is inside them, they're going to pose a continued threat to society. And so this idea, this concept of a double-edged sword emerged to capture sort of, it was a warning. It was kind of like, hey, all you defense people who are running with this stuff into the courtroom, keep in mind, it's not clear how this is going to go. Okay. If you're interested in which way the sword is going to cut, you've got two options. One option is to try to look back over the court records, find instances where this information has been introduced, and see if you can sort of glean any patterns from that information. Okay? And this archival approach has been done very nicely by Professor Deno in town here at Fordham University. Nita Farahani is a law professor at Duke University. They've both spent a great deal of time and paid for many, many research assistants to pore through criminal trials and basically find those cases that have genetic or neurobiological information introduced, and then try to see if they see patterns as a result of that. Okay. The other thing you might do is design an experiment. You actually simulate a trial and tweak whether or not that information is included, and then see if you get a result in the outcome. Okay. I am more familiar with the right-hand side, and so what I thought would be useful for the context of this gathering was to talk about what has happened over on that side of the approach, the experimental approach, for the last 10 years, to give you a sense of what patterns are starting to emerge and what are the ethical implications of those patterns that are emerging. But I'll say, if you're interested in each of these approaches has certain virtues and vices, cost trade-offs associated with them, and there's also interesting questions about how those results might feed off each other. I'm happy to talk about that. I'll also just make a quick plug. My colleagues at Utah have a paper coming out in just a couple months, understanding validity in empirical legal research. This is exactly what we talk about. We talk about what's the relationship, what are the costs and benefits of the archive approach, of the experimental approach, and what's the relationship between them. I'm just going to focus on the right-hand side. Okay, so what I did was, a search for studies that would fall into this domain of having explored this experimental context. Okay, so they basically needed to have three things. The independent variable, that is, the thing that they tweaked in the experiment, had to be some sort of neurogenetic explanation or bit of evidence. That's one thing it needed. The dependent variable, the outcome that they're actually measuring, had to be some sort of criminal trial outcome. Okay. This is how I searched for it. Also, just sort of say there are a variety of things that that are sort of in this same space but got excluded. So this is why they would have been excluded. So there's been lots of interesting research on how neurogenetic explanations change other outcomes. And I'll just plug one here because I know one of the authors of it is going to be a postdoc in the Ceer next year. Matthew Leibowitz, who's at Yale probably right now, maybe he's coming next year. Okay. Looked at how when you present actual mental health clinicians with two different explanations of a behavior, I think it was social anxiety, depression, a biological explanation for that, a genetic explanation for that, and a psychosocial explanation for that. The mental health clinicians actually have less empathy towards the patients that had the biological explanation. Fascinating stuff. I don't include it here because the dependent variable wasn't a criminal trial outcome. Similarly, you could have ones there have been lots of experimental studies that look at criminal trial outcomes, but they're not looking at neurogenetic explanations as the independent variable. So there's been research on just how a diagnosis alone can change the chance of getting a higher sentence or getting a conviction. Okay, I don't include that because that's really not what people have been talking about here. It's the introduction of the genetics and it's the introduction of the neuro. And then finally, some people have just surveyed people. Hey, what would you think if we introduce this? What about this? And they've done surveys of what would you think if we introduce this as it relates to punishment? Those aren't experimental though, so it's hard then to kind of infer much from them. Okay, so 17 studies pop up. I'll just very quickly say it's impressive the impact that Columbia University has had on this lineup. So if you actually, at the top of the list, the first paper that sort of kicked much of this off is by Joe Phelan from the Columbia School of Public Health. And in the last 3 years, I would say the individual who shaped this and contributed the most to it is Dr. Appelbaum and his colleague Nicholas Skurich. So there's been a really impressive contribution from Columbia here on a set that of only 17. They're accounting for almost a quarter of them. The first thing I'll just say here is, while what I'm going to be tracking is the way in which their investigations of neurogenetic evidence or explanations affected criminal trial outcomes, lots of these papers were doing lots of other things as well. So some of them were looking at how does genetic information change ideas about other people? Does it affect the way you think they sort of pose a continued threat? Does it create stigma? Does it make you want to socially distance yourself from them? And also, they were also looking at, there's a whole packet of them here that were specifically focused on what does adding pictures do? Not the neurogenetic explanation itself, but what does adding a picture of a brain do? So lots of different stuff going on here. I'm just going to be focusing on the results that have to do with tweaking the neurogenetic variable and looking at the criminal trial outcome. Even on just that, though, I should say, there's an incredible amount of variation. So you've got, on the low end, studies with 50 people to, 1,500 people. A variety of different behaviors, from the very severe, things like murder and rape, to damaging a window, stealing a cookie and breaking a cookie jar, right? And then also there's been quite a few different designs that are implemented. So some of them will just have basically a neurogenetic explanation versus a control, right? Some of them have a neurogenetic explanation versus an environmental explanation. Some will have a variety of different kinds of neuro explanations and compare them to a control. So a lot of different designs. And then finally, the outcomes that they're looking at are also quite varied, in part because the crimes they were looking at were quite varied. So you've got things like, death sentence versus life in prison, guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity, how long are you going to send them away, prison sentence, to also just sort of miscellaneous punishments like, would you treat them more severely? this is a summary of the effects or lack thereof. If this was going to be a proper lit review, you would want to see what are the mean differences. You would want to see the sample sizes for each study. You would want to see the p-values, the significance levels. So I've left that off here because really what I'm trying to do is just get a sense of the pattern. And so basically what you're seeing there is just, was there on the criminal trial outcome with that independent variable, was there an effect or was there not an effect? Okay, if there was an effect, it was statistically significant. If there wasn't, they didn't find it. Okay, rather than go through all of these and melt your eyeballs, I'll just sort of hit a couple of the highlights. The Phelan article is a nice example. Basically what she did was presented to participants two individuals that either had depression or I think it was schizophrenia. The individuals were then told basically how genetic was that trait that they had. So everything from not at all genetic to very much genetic. Okay, and then they got asked, again, this is one of these studies where it was looking at a variety of different things, but one of the things they asked was, if that individual committed a violent crime, you would treat them the same as you would treat anybody else. And it was either you completely agree with that statement or you don't agree at all. Right? And basically what she was trying to get at was, right, does adding that genetic component tweak the extent to which you sort of see that person as being worthy of the same kind of judgment you would give somebody who didn't have that genetic component? This Dar-Nimrod paper is interesting. What they looked at were sex crimes, and they primed people ahead of time to either get an evolutionary psych explanation of sex differences. You might get some sort of evo-psych explanation of why men are more inclined than women to rape. Okay, or you would get a social constructivist explanation of a sex crime, and there would be more about sort of kind of power differentials and the way in which men use their physicality to overpower women. And basically, what they found was, compared to a control, right, basically getting no story at all, participants who got the evolutionary psychological story did not impose higher bails on the person, on John, who tried to solicit a prostitute, and also did not impose longer sentences on the individual who committed a date rape. There are a number of studies in the middle there that looked at neuroimaging, and basically sort of what does adding a neuroimage do. This is the study that my colleagues at Utah and I ran. We looked at judges. They had a violent crime committed. They either got a diagnosis of psychopathy, or they got a diagnosis of psychopathy and a neurogenetic story about that psychopathy. And as you can see, in our case, it slightly reduced the sentence that the judges gave out. I'll also just then highlight Dr. Appelbaum's contributions. So for instance, in the first one that came out in 2014, it was another homicide. Had to figure out how long they were going to sentence. Participants had to decide how long they were going to sentence. They got a variety of different possibilities. A control was just an impulsive individual, a genetic predisposition to violence, an abusive family home, or a genetic predisposition to violence and an abusive family home. They found no impact of the genetic predisposition on sentencing. And I would say that's a pattern that we've seen in a number of Dr. Appelbaum's publications. So the first thing I'll just point out is, notice there are no increases up there. Remember, we're talking about a double-edged sword. The same information should incline you, or could incline you to say, I don't hold that person as responsible, so I'm going to reduce sentence, or make you think, I'm going to increase sentence because this person is more dangerous. But we don't see the aggravation outcome up there. Okay. When you look at then the no effects versus the reduction, what you see is a pretty mixed bag. So of the 17 studies, 5 found what I would just call straightforward no effect. They manipulated a variable, a neurogenetic variable, and it didn't have an impact on the outcome. 6 of them found an effect, namely a reduction. They manipulated some kind of a neurogenetic variable, got a reduction. Okay. And then 6 of them gave a sort of a mixed bag outcome. Okay. And by mixed bag, it could be anything from, well, I'll just give you one example here. in the Rendell article, it was a murder, and then the participants had 2 tasks. The first task was, after getting either a biological or a psychological explanation for the behavior, do they find them guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity? And then of those that found them guilty, they had to sentence them. And so what you can see there is a situation where basically, with the guilt versus not guilty by reason of insanity, there were fewer guilty verdicts if they got the biological as opposed to the psychological. But then once they had to make the sentence, once they were guilty and had to sentence them, it had no impact on the sentence. Okay. So the question here, for me was, what's going on here? It's quite a mixed bag. A couple possibilities. One is, basically this is social psychology. And social psychology, I would say right now, is in a sort of reflective period where we're thinking about, things like publication bias, right? False positives. And that might be what's going on here, right? I will say the one thing that sort of inclines me to think that that's not necessarily the case is it's striking that we're getting all no effects or reductions and no aggravations. You'd think if this was really just kind of chance, that would be a kind of, you'd see some evidence of the aggravation up there. And so the fact that we don't see that at all is quite striking. But I do think there's a possibility for publication bias here in the following way. I mentioned, in addition to those sort of manipulating the neurogenetic and looking for a criminal trial outcome, many of these studies looked at a variety of different outcomes as well. And even those that got a no effect almost certainly found some other effect. Maybe they found that it increased the sense of dangerousness or it decreased the sense of control. So there was a kind of effect. And so it is possible, I think, that maybe there are other people running these studies that are getting genuinely no effect, like no effect across the board, and then they're just not submitting them to journals, right? Or they are submitting to the journals and editors are saying, this isn't interesting, right? So that's a possibility. But I mean, it's a possibility for this literature as much as it is for social psychology generally. I mean, so let's table that. The second question that I think is interesting is, keep in mind when we get no effect, there's actually 2 possible ways to interpret this, right? And I'll call one the dull blade interpretation, and I'll call the other the equally sharp interpretation. So one reason we might not get any effect is because basically the science isn't having an impact. Neither blade of the sword is sharp enough to get an effect, right? And so, to go back to the experiment from the beginning, if I gave you that psychiatric information and then I gave you the additional neurobiological information and you didn't change your sentence for Stephen, it could just be that you were like, this science is bogus, right? I can't unthink what I heard for the last 3 hours. I'm not going to incorporate that at all, okay? But there's another possibility here, which is, you actually are taking that science into consideration, but what's happening is it's kind of cutting equally for you. You're thinking, well, on the one hand, they lack control. On the other hand, geez, they're just going to do this again. And so the net result is kind of equal forces or equally sharp blades, and we get a no effect as well. And so I think an interesting question is, could we distinguish these results to figure out which it is? And I think we can. The test is to artificially or circumstantially dull one of the blades. Okay? And it turns out that we can look at this literature and see that happen. Okay? When the outcome was a straightforward sentence, jurors are genuinely faced with the double-edged sword. They're wrestling with, to what extent did this person have control over their behavior? And, yeah, but I really want to keep them out of society, so the longer the better. There are also, though, a number of other criminal trial outcomes that really dull the future dangerousness edge of the sword. Okay? So, for instance, death sentence versus life without the possibility of parole. They've basically taken future dangerousness away from the jurors for consideration. Right? It's just about to what extent did they have control, or are they responsible. Okay. Guilty versus not guilty by reason of insanity does something sort of similar. It asks you for the moment to hold off how you think about what you're going to do with this person and just evaluate kind of what was going on in their head at the time. And as a result, it really kind of eliminates jurors' ability or judges' ability to think about future dangerousness at that particular step. And then finally, A couple of them sort of artificially do it. So this Sharif article is interesting in this way. It's a murder. Participants were either exposed to or not exposed to information that would have inclined them to lose their faith in free will. But then they're told at the sentencing phase, they say, okay, that person is going to go to an institute for 2 years and be completely rehabilitated. And now you need to figure out how long you're going to sentence them to prison. And so what they basically do is take future dangerousness off. It's like kind of, don't worry about it. They're now not going to do it again. You just need to figure out what they deserve, how in control they were, and how responsible they were. And then there's a couple here that I'll just kind of list for miscellaneous. These are the ones that sort of do things like, it's not so much it's harder to classify as whether or not a sword blade has been dulled, because it'll say things like, to what extent would you treat that person similarly or differently? And I don't think those lend themselves to this easy divide. A number of the studies you'll see are up there twice because they're actually measuring multiple things. So for instance, take Appelbaum 2015. It's up here and up here because those participants, some of them had to make a decision about a sentence, some of them had to make a decision about not guilty versus not guilty by reason of insanity or death sentence. Okay. To go back to that previous slide, if it was the dull blades interpretation, what you would expect is basically the no effects and the reductions would be sort of equally distributed. Okay. Here's what we get. So the studies that found no effect of punishment almost exclusively in the sentencing exercise. The one outlier here is these participants had to think about kind of what do you do with a fourth grader who misbehaves, or what do you do with a college kid who misbehaves? And again, this is one it's a little bit more difficult to classify. Okay, so the studies that we found straight no effect are primarily up in that punishment exercise. The studies that found straight reduction are almost entirely contained down here. The one outlier here is our study from Utah, but I can tell you we found a very small effect. And basically it was a difference between going to jail for almost 14 years or going to jail for almost 13 years. So literally just 1 year. It was an effect, it was a statistically significant effect, but it was a small effect. Then we get the example, the ones that were mixed, the kind of mixed results. And I'll just admit here, some odd things are going on. A lot of them are weird interaction results. So you get things like, for a psychopath, if they introduce neuro evidence, a reduced sentence, or death sentences compared to life in prison. But for schizophrenics, they didn't get a result. Right? This one sort of combined environmental information with the genetic. It was like if you got the neurogenetic explanation in an abusive home, you had a lower sentence than in a loving home. But if you didn't have the neurogenetic explanation, the result was flipped. So sort of odd things. But then I also want to just flag, there was a couple of what I was calling mixed results earlier, but they're actually mixed results in exactly the way you would expect if it's the equally sharp interpretation. Namely, in the exercise where they had to have where the blade was dulled, they got an effect. And then when both blades were available, it disappeared. So for instance, in the Rendell paper here that I mentioned earlier, biological versus a psychological explanation of violent behavior, they had to decide between guilty versus not guilty by reason of insanity. At that decision point, getting the biological explanation decreased the guilty verdicts. But then when you move them over to the sentencing exercise, where now both blades of the sword can operate, sure enough, they don't get an effect up there. Right? Something similar here happened with the Cho and Heim paper that just came out recently. They first gave them a biological explanation of violent behavior. This was a stabbing. And the first series of questions they asked them was, would this incline you to give a diminished responsibility or diminished capacity or an insanity rather than guilty verdict? And adding that biological information did increase preferences for things like not guilty by reason of insanity and diminished capacity. But then when they had to actually sentence them, it disappeared. There was no effect. Okay. So, again, this might be chance, might be publication bias. I guess what I would sort of tentatively say is, it looks to me like when we consider the distribution of where we're getting the results and not getting the results, and the fact that most of the no effects are coming up when both blades are available, and most of the actual reductions are coming when that particular aggravating edge of the sword has been reduced. I think we've got sort of preliminary support for the double-edged sword being a real thing. Let me move then to how much more time do I have? Okay, let me then move to one other observation, which I think is very interesting. A number of these other studies also looked at the impact of social family variables. Okay, and in particular, it was abuse. To what extent were you raised in an abusive home? And this was really shocking. So 1, 2, 3. So there's 6 of them there that also included some sort of element of being raised in an abusive home. Almost across the board, if you were if the explanation appealed to rearing, to being abused, the punishment went up. Right? If you were raised in an abusive home, the punishment went up. It was less likely to give you not guilty by reason of insanity. It was less likely to get you life in prison as opposed to death sentence. Okay. The Scourge and Appelbaum paper again here is an outlier. They did not find that adding that bit did it. Although in an earlier paper they did find that the abusive home actually did increase. Okay. So let me just sort of point to what I think are kind of interesting ethical implications of the pattern that we're starting to see here. The one thing is on the social family divide, this is just really weird, right? So let's go back to Stephen who, commits road rage and shoots somebody. On any version of, sort of philosophical account of free will, right? The idea is essentially, well, not on any version. I think this basic point applies to any version, but let me just go with the most popular version of free will, which is the ability to do otherwise, right? The reason we punish Stephen when he shoots somebody in a road rage incident is because the thought is, look, there was a time when Stephen had the ability to think about whether or not he was going to pull out that gun, right? He could have helped the little old lady cross the road, right? But he didn't. He pulled out a gun and shot somebody. And when you have the ability to do otherwise, but you do the wrong thing, we hold you responsible for that and punishment ensues. Okay? Now, also, if it turns out that there are things, part of your causal story, that impede your ability to kind of make this decision, right, that make you more inclined to go up here than perhaps down there, then philosophers are inclined to say, yeah, it looks like, you might be less free than other people. Okay? But it doesn't matter what those things are. Right? It's not that, I guess I would put it this way. It's about the extent of the limitation. It's not about the type of the limitation. To the extent that you sort of can't behave freely, that you can't control your impulses, it doesn't matter whether that's the case because you were abused as a kid or because your genes, right, sort of got you wired differently. It's just you can't do it. And so the fact that we're getting a really different readout for the social family than we are up here, I think is just odd. I mean, there's sort of two possibilities. One is, right, philosophers got to do a better job educating the folk. We got to sort of, tell them, hey, you're getting this all wrong, right? I mean, whether you want the sword to cut up, down, or not at all, you should at least be consistent here, right? The other possibility is, and I'm happy to, consider this point, maybe the folk are onto something and the philosophers are sort of missing something here. Maybe there's something interesting about the social family environment that is differently than the way we're, our genes or our brains make us who we are. And we should be thinking about this information differently. I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to sort of hear it out. And then the last slide, I'll just say, I think we should all care about these results as they apply to the double-edged sword, about whether or not they mitigate and aggravate. One reason we might care is because it's a question about whether this type of neurogenetic science is relevant to these evaluations. And when I capitalize type there, what I mean is some folks have said this neurogenetics stuff just doesn't belong in the courtroom. Courts assume free will. Courts evaluate things like desires, beliefs, could have done otherwise. And so telling jurors or judges about molecules or neurons is just irrelevant. And other people have said, no, actually, beliefs, desires, ability to do otherwise or not are actually, products of these, and so they should be a part of it. Okay? But even if you are willing to grant maybe these things should be a part of it, you could drop down to that second question, which is, it's about whether or not this type of neurogenetic science is relevant. You might think, yeah, I can see how neuroscience or genetics could be relevant to these evaluations, but the kind of science we're getting from neuroscientists and geneticists right now is not providing that. And I think, Dr. Burt's example of the GWA, that came up completely blank, right? If we've got expert witnesses going to courts and saying this person had a gene that made them less able to control their impulses, but the GWAS saying we don't have any gene that's doing that, right? Then I think it's more about whether this type of neurogenetic science is actually relevant. But I think, we've got 17 studies here. The literature is growing fast, and I think it's going to be interesting to watch. But the patterns I see it does look like the sword is cutting towards mitigation, and then we get this just really odd thing with the environmental social impact, which is people are punitive towards people who have been child abused, which I just think is very, very odd. Thanks.
An answer to my question, does it matter? So I'll ask the two speakers to come up. And Dr. Appelbaum will be moderating this discussion. And I'm really pleased to be able to say something about him today. He's the director of our center. He is the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law, and Director of the Division of Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry in the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry. He's also, as I said, Director of our Ceer. Dr. Appelbaum is a world-renowned expert on ethical and legal issues in medicine with a primary focus on genetics and genomics. He is past president of the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, and the Massachusetts Psychiatry Society, and he's currently chair of the DSM Steering Committee for the American Psychiatric Association, and also of the Standing Committee on Ethics of the World Psychiatric Association. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine, and, really glad to have him here. Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers and to all of you for hanging out till this point in the conference. Although I expect that you share my view at this point that it has been an incredibly stimulating and interesting afternoon. I want to open this up for your questions and comments. But first, Jim, I just want to get a clarification from you about one issue, if I can, and that is the studies that you showed were not limited to genetic evidence. They included neurobiological explanations, which might or might not have been genetic.
That's right. Yeah. So some of them, the distinctions were between, just a clinical psychological explanation. This person has trouble controlling their desires, and then neuroscientific information. And so, in that sense, it's not just about behavioral genetics. I was calling it neurogenetic. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So we're open for your comments, Eric.
So just a question for Jim.
Actually, Eric, since you're in the front, if you want to use the mic up here, that'd be great.
This is a question for Jim about the role that effect size plays on both sides. Both in the courtroom nowadays, when lawyers are going in and saying this guy has a gene that makes him more likely to commit a violent act, and then again in the study when the information is provided to the participants, unless there's data that I don't know about, the accurate thing for the attorney to say would be there's a gene that confers an odds ratio of 1.04 that makes this person, and I would think that would have a very different effect than the more lawyerly thing of making it sound as though there's genetic information out there that makes it very, very compelling that this person couldn't have done anything else. So are they both in the courtroom accurate, and in the studies are effect sizes associated with it?
I should say Dr. Appelbaum is able to comment on this as well. Let me start with the studies. Typically in the studies, it's just dictated oftentimes in very few words. It would just sort of say, this individual had a gene that made it difficult for him to control his impulses. And it's just sort of kept at that level.
That's super inaccurate. I mean, that's
okay.
misleading.
Okay. And then some of them go into great detail. They'll say, there's this gene that controls this part of this brain chemistry. On the ones on the neuroscience side, right, they'll sort of show a picture of the brain. Maybe they'll combine it with information about frontal lobe damage and say, look here. When you're doing these experimental setups, right, it's hard to take, let's just say, your talk or Dr. Burt's talk, right, and get someone to stare at a screen for a half hour and listen to that and then make a sort of decision about what they're going to do, right? It's sort of like the long ones are 1,000 words in terms of the whole trial. The short ones are sometimes, 100 words. But what you're getting at is we might have some real concern about ecological validity and the extent to which these results, can be extrapolated to what happens in actual court cases. If you want to know what happens in actual court cases, I do encourage you to look at Professor Deno at Fordham Law has a number of papers, and Professor Farahani at Duke has a number of papers. And what you find there is, I think this is a case where the experimental stuff has some catching up to do. The genetics is used in a variety of different ways. It confirms a diagnosis. It's combined with family history. Unfortunately, though, oftentimes we don't get actual trial transcript, so they just sort of tell us, they mentioned it here at this particular point in the court case, and then this was the outcome.
Yeah, no, and my impression is there's not a lot of discussion of odds ratios in the actual testimony. To be fair to some of the experimental studies, many authors are trying to test the impact of a truly impactful genetic variant without pretending that exists today. They're looking at the question of whether, at least hypothetically, it would affect the behavior of the deciders, whether they're lay people or judges. But admittedly, your point is valid in that case. That is, it doesn't exist today. Eric.
Do you want me to go there?
Yeah, if you. Ruth has a mic.
Most of your questions, Dr. Burt. I'm interested, in sex differences. So I'm just wondering.
So you may have to hold it right in front of your mouth.
Right there. No, I usually push something.
Yeah, turning it on.
Oh, wait a second.
It's not on.
They're turning it on.
Hello. No.
All right. So why don't you come up here?
Now it's on. It is on.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. So, violent behavior is, I presume, it's really not my field, but I think it's highly sexually dimorphic, and there's much more likely to have violent behavior with the male genetic sex. So I guess I have a couple questions for the panel, most for you. If you do the GWAS and you just sort of look only at females, the few females, so because if they do have violent behaviors, isn't it more likely to find some genetic factors? Because despite the lack of androgens, say, or Y chromosome, they still are violent. Isn't that more likely? And have the sexes been separated? And I was just wondering, as I'm thinking, is there differences in sentencing, whether it's a male or a female who is actually doing the same violent act? So I guess it's a question for everyone.
Yes. So in that particular study, they did look at it separately by sex. They found 2 SNPs that appeared to be important for women and 1 for men/boys. But none of those reached the full genome-wide, but so yes. And I can tell you, as someone who's done lots and lots of twin studies and adoption studies of these phenotypes, across, in a big meta-analysis, if you look for sex differences in heritability, for example, usually there'll be something there, but it has not emerged as statistically significant in a meta-analysis. But I will say that if you look across the studies, whenever there is a sex difference, it is always the case that the behavior is more heritable in women than in men. Always. I mean, in my experience, always. I'm talking across 50, 60 studies. Yeah. But one thing I was thinking, Eric and his student, she's an associate professor now, but his former student Paige and I were talking. She's not your student anymore either. I have a question, sort of, which is that there is a gene, a set of genes that is a very strong predictor of violent crime. And it's robust. It persists across age. It persists across society. Or across time, and that's the Y chromosome. So, right, it is technically, but so we don't. Does that shift the way we think about in the neurogenetic? Yeah. Anyway, does that shift that at all?
Go ahead.
I mean, Paul might want to add something, but I think there's a sense in which the experiments have been biased by this. I don't think anybody's run a study where the offender is female. Do you know? No?
I can't think of one.
Yeah, there's usually some sort of, they're men behaving poorly.
Right.
Yeah.
But we don't think of that as a gene that would reduce sentencing necessarily, right? Because there's lots of men in this room, and they've not committed violent crimes to my knowledge, right? So, yeah.
Alexandra, since you mentioned the GWAS, could you say a little bit more about it? It was a meta-analysis, so there were multiple samples combined. How was violence ascertained? Just tell us a little about the background.
So it was a variety of samples. There were samples assessing criminality directly. There were samples of behavior in children that would antisocial behaviors in children. It was, as is the case with many GWA, it was some sloppy phenotyping in between us. But I mean, you don't really have a choice, right? You've got to combine samples, and they're not all assessed the same way. And you got to increase your sample size, because to hit genome-wide significance, you need a ginormous N. That's the official term. So it was broad, and that is one of the, I think, potential. Certainly a limitation of the study.
How did it make away fair?
Poorly, very poorly. It didn't show up at all. In fact, none of the candidate genes that we'd thought of as important were implicated.
So we've got a hand over here.
This is more for Dr. Tabery. I just wonder whether what you've been showing us really just reflects the way the law works. I mean, the legal approach to guilt and sentencing is still really rooted in a 19th century conception of how the brain works. There have been little sort of alterations to that over time, but essentially we're still in that model. And I think what you're really seeing is just that the legal profession haven't caught up with the genome revolution yet. So at the moment, if you asked a lawyer's not going to be surprised that the sorts of information you're talking about has an effect in deciding whether someone's guilty or not, but not in sentencing, because lawyers are taught that that's the way things should work, because differences between people's brains and in fact their environment, are largely irrelevant at sentencing. They're really only relevant at guilt.
So let me tell you what I see, the general pattern of when they are introduced, and then you tell me if that conflicts or aligns with what you just said. But when this stuff has had purchase in actual trials has primarily been at the sentencing phase, and it's because of the different standards that are used in when evidence can be introduced. The thought is to be deemed guilty versus not guilty. What will be relevant at the decision has to hit a pretty high bar. At sentencing, and especially in cases where the decision is between death and life in prison, defense attorneys can throw just about anything in there to see what sticks. Kind of like short of astrology, you can kind of give it a pass and see, with the hope being that something resonates with jurors. So I guess what I'm sort of getting at is my sense of the reviews of the actual cases is when this stuff does, in the famous cases where it did look like it had a bit of an impact, it was at the sentencing phase. It wasn't at the verdict.
I think that's quite true, but what it might be revealing then is more about just the way jurors have a basic reaction to that sort of information. I guess the point I was trying to make is to the judge at least, or in terms of what the judge should be telling the jury. Mm-hmm. The legal principle is that it shouldn't have such an effect at that stage. I mean, there are exceptions, but the basic paradigm is it's largely irrelevant. And I guess my real point is this. I just think that the law needs to catch up. I mean, there is a big revolution to come, but it's really a revolution in the actual legal precedent as to how this genetic information is to be used, because at the moment it's quite deficient.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think many people would agree with you, particularly in the neuroscience side of the table. But on the legal side of the table, if you haven't read it yet, you might want to look at some of the things that Steve Morse, who's a professor at Penn, has written, because Steve makes a very strong case for what he would call the folk psychology that's embedded in law as a valid and useful way of thinking about responsibility. And Steve, for one, is not inclined to see that change, at least until we get to a much higher level of evidence available than is available today. Okay, and then we have Ruth, we have a hand over here next. So.
Oh, hi. I guess my question is for Dr. James Tabery. You had mentioned that for perpetrators who were found to have abuse in their background, that didn't lessen the punishment for them. I was wondering whether there were any gender differences. Did it make a difference whether the perpetrator was male or female?
So I don't think we've had a study that's considered a female offender. And just to be clear, it's not just that the abuse didn't affect, it was that it showed this consistent pattern of increasing punishment.
Okay. I was just speculating the possibility that with male perpetrators, there is also this idea that aggression and violence is reinforced and often encouraged. So that might have actually, had the opposite effect of generating sympathy. So, whereas with females, it might have had a different outcome.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's occurred to me in the last 30 minutes is it'll be interesting to see somebody run one of these where they consider a female offender. It hasn't happened, and I'd be interested to see what happens with it.
Gabriel. Gabriel?
Question for...
No, you have to hold it right close to your mouth.
Really? And maybe I can stand up so that you can see me. Question for Dr. Burt about the GWAS study again. Just wondering about the N value for the controls and the inclusion-exclusion criteria for controls. Is it just simply no violent history or no conviction?
Well, I can only speak to a portion of the studies. Most of the studies so the ones that I participated in, right, because they were combining samples, they were sort of epidemiologic samples, population-based. So there wasn't a control group per se. They were assessing 1,000 people. And then looking at a variation in the behavior across that. So there were some people with none and some people with lots, and then many in between. So so they used more of in the studies that I was involved in, they used more of a quantitative approach versus a qualitative, crime versus not crime, which is actually something that as someone who studies antisocial behavior, there's this huge mismatch in a way between the two fields, because criminal justice work tends to be very like either you committed a crime or you didn't commit a crime, sort of ignoring the fact that there are lots of people who commit crimes and don't get caught, or that they might have engaged in lots of other behavior, right? So it's just a different way. It's a more psychological way. So I wonder, I actually will have to look and see. I don't remember if they actually pulled those two sets of studies out. I know that the polygenic risk score that they were able to put together worked essentially as well in a sample that was a criminal control sample, and then a population-based sample, and the polygenic risk score that they developed based on the weighted average of all of the SNP scores worked as well in the one as in the other. So I'd have to look more closely, but I think there's different ways that they were done. I don't know if that's helpful.
So was Katie next?
Thank you both. This was great. I have a question for Jim about the childhood abuse, strange childhood abuse data. And I guess I was taken with Eric Turkheimer's suggestion that we have very different intuitions about simple versus complex causes. I think I disagree with him about whether or not they're justified, but I'm interested in the fact that we have them. And I'm wondering if this data might suggest that in the case of childhood abuse, so I take it there, one of the sides of the sword is sharp and one is dull, so we think that childhood abuse should cause people to be punished more severely, and we don't think it's exculpatory. I mean, that would be one possible interpretation of that data.
If you tried to apply the sword metaphor, that's the result you're getting.
Okay. So if that's the case, it might suggest that something like childhood abuse we would think is a complex cause. So it would be the opposite of something like a monogenic cause for a trait. And I'm wondering if this might suggest that that's actually maybe what the intuitions are about. That it might be less about genetic versus not genetic and more about complex versus simple. So we might want to think about potential experimental design for testing this. So if we had a monogenic trait versus a polygenic trait, but we had genetic information, would we see different results? Or if there would be another way to kind of test that hypothesis, because it seems like it's not disconfirmed from the studies that you described.
Yeah, that sounds, I like the thought. And I would say it could be, you made that distinction between it's not about being genetic versus not genetic, it's about being monocausal versus complex. It could be that people tend to think about genetic information monocausally, and they tend to think about environmental information more complexly. And I would say, the literature on genetic essentialism, that's what it shows. You guys have Matt Leibowitz, again, coming from Yale next year. He's an expert in this. He's contributed to it. And so, what you're getting is maybe it's not so much just the gene, it's the way in which that term makes people think about causes, however inaccurate.
Yeah, while Ruth gets the mic to the next commenter, let me just say, Katie, there's another explanation that's out there offered in the literature as a hypothesis to explain the finding, which, by the way, goes well beyond this type of study. There are other studies out there that show punitive responses to people who are described as having histories of child abuse. And that's the abuse excuse explanation, which is to say there has been so much discussion of childhood abuse leading to later life consequences that the average Joe or Jill in the street is just fed up with it. And the reaction is, spare me, you were abused, I was abused, we all had tough lives, and that doesn't excuse anything that you're doing. In contrast, the neurogenetic, neuroimaging kinds of data may be seen as privileged because more medical in nature and therefore more persuasive or more acceptable.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's so distinct though, because I think there similarly might be the idea that we can't really explain how childhood abuse causes downstream effects in a way that would demarcate clearly in the way that a monocausal.
Yeah, that may well be right. That may well be right. Okay, so we've got another commenter here.
So this actually builds on what you were saying about how this has been observed, or at least the contrast between the double-edged sword of the genetic and kind of neuroscience explanations and the punitive effect of the more social explanations. That contrast is being observed in the courtroom. I was wondering if any of the speakers could speculate. So the courtroom is a very, very downstream outcome, and there's already a lot of selection in terms of who's going to wind up in front of a judge, in front of a jury. And I was wondering if you could speculate about whether you think that dynamic would be at play in earlier stages, either in like the arrest stage of the criminal justice system or in something like school discipline, where we might see behavioral problems that are less extreme but are risk factors for later criminal involvement?
I mean, I guess what comes to mind for me is the literature on genetic essentialism, and what that shows is the mock jurors in these studies and the judges who participate in these studies are not unusual. Humans in general, you give them a kind of genetic story, they start thinking that person's different from me, they start thinking what they've got is going to stay that way, they start thinking it's not going to be susceptible to getting better, they start thinking I don't want to spend as much time around them. That kind of social distancing, stigma, worry about future dangerousness, sense of loss of control. That's a wide literature, and it sort of shows over and over again that when you give people a genetic story or a neurobiological story, they'll also talk about neuroessentialism. People, I mean, the sort of general thought is we're sort of, it's easy to think essentialistly, and so we're always looking for something that we can plug in that lets us then kind of carve up the world easily. And maybe that's race or gender, right? But right now, in the kind of, 21st century, genes are filling in that blank by and large, and people are happy to use them to talk about why they're different from us.
Alexandra, did you want to respond to that? No?
That's okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we've got 12 minutes left in the program, and we had said at the end we'd save some time for questions or comments directed at any of today's speakers. And although we don't have enough chairs up here to bring them all up, we can change that environmental reality. Genetics can't be changed, but environment can. This is the time to do it, so let's ask Eric, and Bill to come up here and join us, and we'll continue with the discussion, but you should feel free to direct your questions or comments at any of our speakers. Please, go ahead.
No, thank you. I'm actually glad that the concept of genetic essentialism came up, because I'm currently studying with students of Steve Hine, and I'm sort of more interested in the psychological side, and sort of slipped into studying antisocial behavior because I was interested in just generally the psychological effects or perceptions of changing socially problematic behavior. And so I started looking at genes, and I'm really glad that Dr. Turkheimer brought up his comment, and also Katie, I don't know your last name, because I actually did start looking at odds ratios, and I presented people with these sort of realities and looked at what people's perceptions were, and you're actually dead on. I've now have 3 studies that show that despite having these odds ratios in there, people persistently perceive genes as a simple causal relationship, whereas in no cases have any of my studies been able to confirm that any environmental or psychosocial causes are perceived the same kind of way. So there's definitely the distinction between complex and simple issues. And then I also have a question for Dr. Burt, because I was really interested when you were saying that aggression is sort of online at age 7. You still kept talking about having different behavioral interventions and how, we might want to intervene early, but it seems if the trajectory doesn't change, does then parenting or any kind of behavioral intervention even still matter, I guess, quote unquote. And I'm also really interested in your perceptions of how seeing social issues sort of in genetic or psychosocial causes then changes people's ideas about what we can do. So whether parenting would be an effective way of dealing with children who are behaving aggressively.
So, as with any, speaking as a clinical psychologist, as with any behavior disorder that you want to treat, the earlier you can do it, the better. So if the behavior is onsetting, that's why I one of the reasons I wanted to really mention when the behavior onsets, because I think that if you're treating 13-year-olds, they've already been engaging in that behavior for 10 years. It's just a harder hill to, it's a steeper hill to climb. If you can instead be, if we can focus our prevention interventions on littles, like preschool age, there's going to be a lot of kids who look like they might engage in the behavior and would have desisted on their own, but we actually might have an opportunity to enact real change in the kids who were going to persist. And I think what the data that I'm familiar with, what they would suggest is that sort of traditional punishment-based strategies are probably not going to be the most effective, that you're going to need to think outside the box in terms of the types of interventions that you would enact, because the data actually suggests that the most severe kids, literally just simply don't respond to punishment. They often will escalate their behavior in response to punishment, which is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm not totally sure if I'm answering your question, but to me, I mean, when I think about genetic essentialism, like, okay, so, the color of your eyes, right? We think, okay, well, I didn't do anything for my eye color. It just is here, and it's just my genes. But I think once you frame genetic influences on antisocial behavior as, like, Y chromosome, then it's like, oh, wait a minute. There's lots of people with Y chromosomes, and they're not actually, most of them aren't doing those things. So I think it changes I think the way we talk about genes is people think eye color, right? But I don't think they necessarily think gender, even though gender is in fact genetic, right? Or not gender, sorry. Biological sex is genetic. Gender is not genetic, or maybe it is. I don't know. I'm very confused. But biological sex is, right? And for nearly all of us. And so for me that changed. For me that was a sort of a revelation when it's not my revelation. It was some Greg Carey's revelation, but. Anyway, I don't know if that helps or not, but for me that changes how I think about genes and antisocial behavior.
Eric, did you want to respond to the first part of that? Eric?
I'm forgetting exactly what part I would respond to.
Do you want to? Could you say again what you started with?
Oh, right, the part
responding.
where giving the effect size information didn't change their...
Yes.
I guess that gets to what is frankly my skepticism about this whole enterprise, the experimental part of this that we've been talking about, which is I would hate for it to be nothing more than an exploration of lay people's misperceptions about the way genetics works. I mean, that's an interesting enough topic, but in fact, in fact, to me, sometimes it seems to have the quality of leading people to believe that we as neurogeneticists can get information about people and make predictions about people that we can't in fact do or make, and then seeing how they respond to being misled in that way. I mean, the fact of the matter is we cannot, out of people's DNA, unless they happen to have an identical twin, we cannot get information out of their DNA that says anything terribly interesting about how likely they are to commit a violent crime. And to me, that's just a fact. I mean, it may be statistically significant, and maybe for some scientific purposes, a odds ratio of 1.04 is interesting, and it may lead us down some interesting scientific roads. But, and I just worry that we're not doing our job if we're saying to juries or saying to our participants, this person has a genetic condition that makes him more likely to commit a violent crime, in a way that leads them to think that he's much more likely to commit a violent crime or is compelled to commit a violent crime, as opposed to the complex genetic background of saying, well, genes are a very complex influence on everything that people do, including whether or not they're violent or get divorced. And I guess I'm back on my hobby horse here, and I don't know, yeah, maybe not.
No. What I was going to say in all this discussion, that I'm surprised is of not hearing in this discussion of whether it's either genes, some genetic determinism versus what happened during their childhood and whether you were abused, is the epi word. When nobody talks about epigenetics, which we could tell the jurors, well, something happened in childhood, and what if, we couldn't make up this story, but maybe it's true, but that something impacted the way genes are expressed, and now to make it even more complicated, and it could be transgenerationally transmitted, etc., etc. There is, as I'm sure there is some now epigenetics of survivors of Holocaust, of survivors of slavery, so there is like all these major life stressors that have some impacts. Whether it has any behavioral consequences or not, nobody knows, but then it sort of now brings together a complexity that's sort of like makes it a little bit genetic, if the sort of life becomes a little bit genetics. And I'm just wondering if any of you have sort of thought about discussing that.
Can I just have like 1 second to respond, and then we can open it up to questions? Thanks for both of your comments, and I totally agree. And I've been trying to, I don't think actually that people just don't understand, or people just don't have any idea of what genes mean. And I've been really careful in trying to actually include variability, and I've been trying to explain to people that aggressive behavior has a multitude of different causes, and yada yada yada. What I find really interesting is I actually come to disagree with a lot of my supervisors, and I don't really call it genetic essentialism anymore, because what I found is that it's not actually, I can't show the same trajectories that people claim in terms of people just believing it's essential, because as I was mentioning, I'm looking at whether people believe that socially problematic behavior can be changed. And if it was true genetic essentialism, people shouldn't think that it could be changed. But people generally think it can be changed. It's just different in how you would do that and how you would go about that. So
I think we probably have time for one more comment. Ruth?
I'm just thinking about, the financial implications of all of this. We've reached the end of our day, but nobody has invoked the word precision medicine. And I think that's wonderful, but I'm going to do it. We're spending a lot of money looking for genes that cause everything. And, one of the implications of the poor correspondence between identified genes and behaviors comes out of what Dr. Burt presented, which is that if you're living in an impoverished environment, the heritability is much lower and the environmental effects are much higher. And we're not spending as much money to deal with the impoverished environments and their potential effects on things like violent behavior as we are on the precision medicine program. So that's my soapbox for the day.
And that may fit with the whole child abuse issue that we were talking about as well. Child abuse, don't tell me about it. But if you have a gene that I can look at and pin this on, well, then I'm willing to listen to you. I actually want to take 30 seconds just to respond to Eric here at the end, because, and I have a slightly different read of the literature on the impact of genetic explanations on perceptions of responsibility and punishment than Jim does. I think the reason I asked Jim about to underscore the point that there's a mix of neurobiologic studies that were listed on his slides is I think if you just pull out the genetic studies, the studies that have looked at genetic explanations of behavior, what you find overwhelmingly are a lack of effect of those studies, or very small effects if there are effects found. And to me, Eric, that's the most interesting thing here. And when we designed subsequent waves of our work, for example, and this question came up of maybe we should tell people what the odds ratios actually are, or what percentage of violence is actually impacted by these genes, we decided not to do that because we weren't even finding an effect by exaggerating the impact of the genetic evidence. So I think there's some interesting work to be done to think through why that is the case, what it is as opposed to some of the neuroimaging studies or other kinds of explanation for behavior to which people are willing to attribute causal responsibility that they're not willing to buy from the genetic explanations at this point, and maybe appropriately so, but nonetheless there's that hesitance to embrace that as an explanation and to see it as something that reduces responsibility.
Is that, I don't know the neuroimaging literature, is that accurate? Can you get big effect sizes looking at, like, ask scientists to predict who's violent from the neuroimages and get effect sizes that are bigger than a polygenic risk score? So isn't it just that people are... Well, yes, so if Charles Whitman, but... So isn't it just that people are... It's easier to mislead people with pictures of brains and what we can do with pictures of brains than it is to mislead them with genetic information?
Well, I mean, I put it this: you would be a very bad expert witness for the defense.
Yeah,
right?
That's for sure.
But I mean, part of what these experiments are designed to do is to test what would happen if the people heard this. And there are plenty of scientists that are willing to tell a simple story about, I found the part of the brain that makes you a psychopath, or we found the gene that does this, and that's getting in the courtroom. So
it's the same BS that they put in their last grant application.
But the point is, if it's getting in, we want to know whether or not it has an impact, regardless of whether or not we think it's accurate.
Alexandra, last word.
Okay. Well, this is a strange last word, but I have wondered before if the amount of money that NIH is putting into genetic discovery sort of dwarfs environmentally focused research at the moment. I mean, my own feeling is that part of it, I think, is that there's this scientists, we want to discover the next new big thing. And it seems like the genes are the area where we don't know a lot. And so if I can get in there and, it seems both NIH and the investigators are sort of pulling because that feels new. Even though the environmental stuff might actually be, bigger effect sizes, it actually has far more direct treatment implications than the genetic piece does, at least as of yet. And yet, there's so much more focus. And I think there's a sort of people want to be, they want to be scientifically famous. They want to discover the next new thing. And we're, just as flawed. I mean, we're just flawed, I guess. So, and stop.
So there you have it. At the end of the day, we're all just flawed.
Yes.
Flawed. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers for today. And Ruth Ottman and her committee who did an awful lot of work putting today together.